So, Paul Feig, the director behind huge comedies like Bridesmaids, is back with a new thriller called The Housemaid. It's based on a mega best-selling book, and critics are, well, they're buzzing. But they're not all saying the same thing. Some people are loving the crazy twists, while others are pointing out some pretty big problems. So what's the deal? Is it a super fun, high-trash thriller, or is it just a mess that can't figure out what it wants to be? Let's break down what the critics are saying.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the movie's setup, which might feel a little familiar. Then, we'll get into the first big twist. After that, we got to talk about the performances, because that's where things get interesting. Then we'll explore the movie's wild shifts in tone, and finally, we'll wrap it all up with the critics' final verdict.
Okay, first things first, the premise. When The Housemaid kicks off, it feels like we've been here before. It's setting the stage for a classic psychological thriller, and it feels pretty recognizable.
So, we meet Millie, played by Sydney Sweeney. Her life is kind of falling apart. She's just out of prison, she's living in her car, and she is desperate for a job to keep her parole officer happy. So this live-in gig with the super-rich Winchesters in their giant all-white mansion on Long Island, it's not just a job, it's a lifeline. It looks like the perfect escape, but you know it's not going to be that simple.
Right away, the movie starts messing with our heads. It's totally leaning into that classic 90s psycho nanny vibe. Remember the hand that rocks the cradle? It's that kind of setup. We see Millie putting on a sweet face for her interview, but the second she drives away, her expression changes. It's all grim and serious. The movie really wants you to think she's the one with the dark secret, the unhinged interloper about to wreck this perfect family. But just when you think you've got the whole movie figured out, it pulls its first huge twist, and believe me, it completely flips the script on what you were expecting. And this forces you to ask a really important question. Wait a minute, who's the real psycho in this house? Because it might not be who you think.
Yeah, turns out it is not Millie at all. The movie doesn't waste any time showing us that Nina Winchester, the picture-perfect housewife, is actually terrifyingly unstable. I mean, on Millie's very first morning, Nina has a total meltdown over some missing PTA notes. We're talking screaming, throwing things, smashing plates. It's this incredibly violent outburst that immediately makes you realize she is the one to be afraid of. So you might be thinking, why doesn't Millie just get out of there? Well, here's where the movie hits a major snag for a lot of critics. Her parole officer basically tells her if she loses this job, she's going right back to prison. Reviewers were quick to point out that this makes absolutely no legal sense. They called it a junky contrivance that's only there to trap her in the house. But they also said the movie moves so fast, you're almost encouraged to just ignore it and hold on for the ride.
Now, a crazy setup like this really depends on the two lead actresses. But this is where critics found one of the film's biggest issues. It wasn't really an acting duel, it was more of a one-sided fight.
Okay, let's talk about Amanda Seyfried. Critics were pretty much unanimous. She is incredible in this. She doesn't just act unhinged, she goes all in. Reviews called her performance startling, hypnotic, and said she delivers every nasty smile and fake sob with vicious ease. She totally embraces how campy the story is, and it makes her character's chaos just amazing to watch. And then you have Sydney Sweeney. In total contrast, her performance as Millie was seen as way too quiet, too held back. One critic even wrote that she seems to be sleepwalking through most of the film. It's like her subtlety just can't compete with Seyfried's over-the-top energy. The general feeling was that she only really wakes up and has fun in the movie's final scene. So this big gap in performance creates a real problem. Seyfried is so big and loud that Sweeney's character just kind of disappears whenever they're on screen together. It makes Sweeney's own big transformation at the end feel, as one critic said, baffling. It just doesn't feel earned because we haven't seen that side of her before. It left critics wishing for someone who could match Seyfried's wild energy from the very beginning. And this lopsided acting duel feeds right into what critics called the movie's biggest flaw of all, a serious case of tonal whiplash. The film basically feels like it's fighting with itself, like it doesn't know what kind of movie it wants to be.
Here's the core issue. The movie is really two different films. For the first hour or so, it's a very serious, straightforward domestic drama. You're supposed to be feeling Millie's fear. But then, for the last third, it flips a switch and becomes this campy, silly, fun thriller, a lot like Paul Feig's other movie, A Simple Favor. The problem? All the fun stuff shows up way too late in the game.
One critic really nailed the frustration here. They said the shift to this crazier, more self-aware tone is a huge relief after how serious the first half is. But it's also a tease, a glimpse of the movie that could have been if it had just been fun and campy from the start.
You get to see a better, more consistent movie, but only for the last few minutes.
So, after all the twists and the tantrums and the tonal shifts, what's the final word from critics on The Housemaid? Let's get to the bottom of whether this thriller is actually worth your time.
So when you lay it all out, it's a real mixed bag. On the plus side, you have Amanda Seyfried's absolutely killer performance, a really fun and twisty ending, and some smart plays on genre tropes. But on the minus side, you have that unbalanced acting, a slow and way too serious first half, those clunky plot devices we talked about, and apparently some editing so choppy it was getting laughs when it wasn't supposed to.
So really, the big takeaway from the reviews is that The Housemaid is a good time, but it kind of pulls its punches. It just doesn't get as wild and trashy and silly as it feels like it should. You're left with this feeling that there was a much more fun and honestly a much better movie just waiting to break out. But let's finish with this one last thought from a critic. Even with all its flaws, the fact that this movie came out right in the middle of awards season brings up a pretty interesting question. You know, in a world full of super serious prestige films, is there a new space opening up for movies that are just stylish, twisty, and super entertaining? Are we seeing these high trash thrillers becoming important in their own right? It's definitely something to think about.